Across the ancient Iranian texts, one ruler is said to have held the throne for 1,000 years, sustaining his reign not through wisdom, but by feeding brain after brain to the snakes that grew from his body. Archaeologists have uncovered Bronze Age seals and signet impressions, some as early as the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, showing human figures flanked by serpents. Scholars suggest these images may reflect a serpent king motif, an echo that later found form in the Shahnameh, a motif that recurs in both myth and ancient iconography. Tonight we'll explore why this tale, so grotesque and strange, endured across centuries. We will turn slowly to 3 images: the snakes and their impossible hunger, the 1,000-year reign that felt without end, and the binding beneath Mount Damavand. These are the symbols that give the story its weight. And as we listen, we may ask ourselves, how does a single moment set such a chain of suffering in motion? Remember to like, subscribe, and comment on which other legends you would like us to make a video about. It begins with a gesture that looks harmless, a kiss placed upon the shoulders of a prince. Not the force of a sword, not the clash of battle, but a quiet act that would carry the weight of ruin. Zahhak was not born carrying serpents. He was a man shaped, at least at first, by ordinary desires. He longed for greatness, respect, and the assurance that his throne would last. Yet beneath his charm and intelligence lay something less steady, an openness to flattery, an eagerness for more than what was already his. That small, unguarded space was enough for a deceiver to enter. In the stories of the Shahnameh, the deceiver is Ahriman, a devouring spirit in Zoroastrian lore. He did not present himself as a monstrous figure. Instead, Ahriman appeared first as a companion, gentle in his voice and pleasing in his manners. Later, he took the form of a cook, offering Zahhak foods richer than any he had tasted. There is meaning in the disguise. Temptation rarely shows its face as danger. It comes through praise, through gifts, through luxuries that feel like rewards. With each dish and each kind word, Ahriman drew the young king closer, strengthening that desire to hold what lay beyond mortal grasp. When the trap had been prepared, Ahriman asked for a simple reward, the right to place a kiss upon Zahhak's shoulders. It seemed no cost at all. Zahhak, softened by pleasure and eager to oblige the companion who had served him so well, agreed without question. But when those lips brushed his skin, it was as if poison had been written into his flesh. From each shoulder, a black serpent pushed outward, alive, searching, and bound inseparably to him. The court recoiled in shock. What had been hidden inside the man now stood visible, corruption worn as part of his own body. The kiss did not strengthen him, nor bring honor. It branded him with a curse that no healing could erase. He tried, at first, to resist. Zahhak called for blades. He ordered that the creatures be cut away. But the moment one was severed, another grew forth. The wounds closed, yet the serpents returned, always two, always attached. No surgeon could succeed, no medicine could quiet them. They were woven into his life now, a form of suffering that could not be undone. Attempts to wrestle the curse away only proved its permanence, as if the darkness had fused itself with his very blood. And the serpents were not silent companions. They carried restless, hungry mouths. They stirred constantly, demanding to be fed. And they wanted not wheat nor meat from the herds, but something far more terrible. As the court discovered in horror, the snakes demanded a brain for each shoulder every day. It was not enough to sate them once or to delay their feeding. The rhythm became fixed, 2 lives daily, offered simply to keep the creatures from tearing their host apart. From that moment, Zahhak's rule ceased to be guided by choice. He was tethered to slaughter, bound by the appetite of the serpents fastened to him. His throne became something hollow, measured not by wise governance or victories in war, but by whether his attendants could meet the demand of the curse. He had once sought greatness. Now his days turned upon the endless task of keeping his own body at peace. His reign was maintained not by justice, but by the constant sacrifice of his subjects. The people looking at him no longer saw only a king. They saw a man fused with monsters, his humanity shadowed by the snake's endless insistence. And Zahhak himself must have known that he too was being consumed, not only his people. For though the serpents lived on his shoulders, they were as much part of him as his hands. And yet they drew strength by destroying what he was sworn to protect. He was at once master and servant, ruler and prisoner, feeding an appetite that belonged to him and yet controlled him. This was never just the invention of demons. The story makes clear that the kiss punished and revealed the hunger that already lived in him. Zahhak was not forced against every part of his nature. Rather, his ambition created room for corruption to grow. Ahriman did not place desire inside him, but only uncovered it, bound it into form. The serpents were the outward signs of what had always been within, the wish for power without end. The willingness to take more than mortal life was meant to hold. From this moment forward, the crown he wore was not his alone. The snakes became symbols perched at his side, showing that the throne itself had been claimed by hunger. Zahhak was no longer remembered as the handsome prince with a promising future. In every telling, he is recalled as the king with serpents on his shoulders, one who ruled not out of choice but because his body demanded that the killing continue. A single kiss had made visible what unchecked craving could become, a rule of endless feeding. And still the question lingered. The snakes could not be removed. Blades only summoned more. Medicines failed, prayers failed, all counsel failed. What remained was the knowledge that this burden grew back each time it was challenged. It did not weaken. It did not fade. It rooted itself into him as something permanent, something carried into every day. Close your eyes for a moment and picture what it is to live with such companions that never leave you, wounds that never heal. The burden that could never be cut away is what marked Zahhak's reign from the moment the serpents appeared. They were not ornaments resting on his shoulders, nor symbols he could cast aside when it suited him. They fastened into his very flesh, constant companions that rose when he rose and paused only when fed. His body ceased to belong fully to him, and his throne no longer sat firmly in his own command. What attached itself to him demanded a price that could never be eased, not through skill, nor through mercy, nor through any gesture of strength. In the court of Zahhak, every healer, every physician, and even magicians tried their art upon the serpents. They stirred herbs into poultices, recited incantations, and used cold blades with steady hands. The results never varied. If the serpents were cut, they returned. If quieted with medicines, they stirred again, restless. The pattern made plain what the Shahnameh insists. The burden had become inseparable from Zahhak himself. Cutting them only called new life into being. Healers and magicians alike admitted defeat, for this was not sickness but curse, not ailment of the body, but a mark of corruption rooted too deeply to be treated. Later tradition even described this as a sign of moral affliction, a spiritual condition beyond the reach of ordinary remedies. The story does not only recount a physical curse, but uses the image of Zahhak's wounded shoulders to speak of something far more enduring. It tells us that certain stains cannot be scraped clean. The serpents stand as a picture of inner decay placed outward, reminding all who watched that his corruption could not be undone by knives, medicines, or charms. The tale offers it in one quiet lesson. Some forms of corruption cannot be cured by force alone. And so the burden remained with him. What begins as a single error, the granting of a kiss to a deceiver, unfolds into a cycle that could not be interrupted by human effort. Each morning the serpents revived their demands, and each day Zahhak was pressed to obey. Left unchecked, they would writhe, hiss, and tear at him, stilled only by offerings that denied peace to others. To quiet the gnawing at his own flesh, he had to turn outward and take from his subjects. His survival was joined to their loss, fixed and unrelenting. In this way, the curse grew larger than the man himself. It became the condition of the kingdom. The hunger beside his shoulders was not his private misfortune, but his throne's daily cost. Every courtier, every parent in the land came to live within this tension. So long as Zahhak endured, so too did the serpents. That link made the realm itself an extension of his unhealed wound, a place where peace could never last longer than a single feeding. What made the curse most cruel was its rhythm. Day by day, the serpents needed to be satisfied. Twice each dawn the kingdom's life was measured. Youths were taken from their households, one for each serpent, so that the king would not perish. There was no pause in this order, no season free of dread. The cycle made his rule into something repetitive and ritual in nature. What might have been seen as punishment for him spread outward as permanent burden for the people. This strange balance forged Zahhak's longevity. The more his subjects suffered, the longer he lived. His crown held through the centuries because their children were taken from them. What preserved him devoured them, and what guarded his body emptied theirs. His throne turned into a hollow monument, tall but filled with loss. He gained a span of life so great it seemed immortal, but it was life stolen from others. Each generation grew up knowing that it was their lives that ensured the serpent's silence. To dwell in such a state was to live always with dread. Parents woke each morning with fear, not of armies pressing at the borders, but of footsteps in the streets that marked the search for another offering. The difference between safety and grief might be determined at random. Which house would they come to? Which child would be chosen? In this way, Zahhak's burden became theirs. His shoulders bore the serpents, but every household bore their hunger. The lesson was cruelly plain. His shoulders never healed, just as the wounds in his kingdom never closed. Violence reappeared each day, stitched into the very rhythm of life, so that hope could never take steady root. Ordinary remedies, healers, soldiers, wise counsel, could not succeed, because the story insists it was not ordinary sickness or war that kept the people in pain. It was tyranny given form, corruption fastened to his body. The curse could not be lifted by human skill. Only justice beyond him could alter it. But while Zahhak endured his burden daily, the greater weight fell upon his people. Their fear, their loss, their children taken into silence, all of it was born to still the hiss at a king's side. The story leaves us with its quiet question. What would it feel like to live under a ruler whose survival depended on the constant loss of your young? And it is here that the tale turns outward, no longer fixed upon Zahhak alone, but upon the kingdom that lived beneath this curse. For though the serpents whispered at his shoulders, it was his people who carried their hunger into each day. Imagine waking with them, waiting for the sound upon the door. The heart of Zahhak's reign was a demand both simple and terrible, the feeding of the serpents upon his shoulders. Each morning the court was forced to supply 2 human brains, one for each snake. Without them, the creatures stirred and hissed, pressing their hunger upon him until their cries filled the palace. This strange rhythm became law, and a burden laid upon the people. Once the physicians had failed to cut the serpents away, they offered grim counsel that sealed the people's fate. The monsters would rest only when given this food, and so the king decreed it. Every day, 2 of the youth must be brought forth. There was no bargaining, no delay. The order carried the weight of certainty, and the kingdom soon bent itself to this ritual as though it were another kind of calendar. Families lived with fear as quiet as breath, unsure when a knock might come. The sorrow of these days did not need to be loud. It was heavy enough in silence. Parents lingered over their children a little longer, uncertain how much time remained. It was not the noise of battles nor the ruin of storms that defined their lives, but this waiting. Generations passed in the shadow of that waiting, and even laughter lost its strength when so much joy could be taken with a single summons. The losses were not only of numbers, but of spirit. Cities and markets thinned of young voices. Time itself seemed tethered to the king's shoulders, stretching grief across whole centuries. The curse that had bound itself to Zahhak's skin sank deeper. Now the wound belonged to the realm as well. What marked his own body bled into the life of every household, so that no one was spared its reach. And yet, the story carries with it a quieter note. Resistance, hidden in places where no swords were drawn. In the royal kitchens, 2 men named Armael and Garmael saw the suffering and chose to act. They held no armies, commanded no soldiers, and yet from their station at the ovens, they sought a way to spare the young. Ordered to prepare the brains, they obeyed outwardly. But with careful daring, they began to substitute sheep's brains for human ones. Their work was shadowed by constant danger, for discovery meant their lives, yet they persisted. Piece by piece, they drew children away from death. The spared youths could not remain in their homes, lest inquiry reveal the deception. Instead, they were guided out to the mountains and plains, where they might live quietly with goats and flocks. Some tellings go further, saying the children grew to form new hill communities, sometimes linked to the origins of the Kurds. Whether or not one takes that as literal history, the legend reminds us that even amid the darkest tyranny, survival can seed new beginnings. The power of this small defiance touches the story deeply. It tells us that courage can rest in overlooked hands, that even cooks at a tyrant's table can choose a path of mercy. Each hidden substitution was not only the saving of a single life, but also a testimony that Zahhak's power was not absolute. His rule might terrify the households of the kingdom, but in a humble kitchen, an argument was being made against him, steady, quiet, and enduring. In this way, Armael and Garmael offer us a softer reflection. That hope may be tended even where despair reigns. Still, the broader kingdom bore the pattern unbroken. People knew that for Zahhak's rule to last, their losses would have to continue. It was a cruel paradox, as if the realm's very survival depended on its own destruction. Every day that the king lived was bought at the cost of its youth, and so his centuries upon the throne were nothing but an extension of this debt. Communities shared the weight alike. Blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, and families all lived within the same rhythm of uncertainty. In time, the realm itself became like a field too often reaped. Its energy waned by ceaseless cutting. Villages left empty. Echoes of voices carried by wanderers who made their homes elsewhere. Tales of Zahhak lingered not only in royal chronicles, but within families who whispered that their ancestors had either been lost to the serpents or saved by the mercy of the cooks. The shadow of his rule stretched far beyond the palace walls, part memory and part scar. The story lingers with its double image. On the one hand, endless loss, and on the other, secret threads of survival. The brain tithe of the people reveals tyranny not as a single act of cruelty, but as a system that consumes both present and future. And beside it, the quiet resistance of two cooks reminds us that even in despair, a small hand can save more than it seems. But another thread waits within the tale, one that asks a gentler question. How could such horror ever have come to sit upon a throne? Was it only chance that gave a deceiver his crown? Or was there something in what came before that made ruin possible? To answer, the story looks backward, to the king who was radiant before Zahhak, one whose loss of humility opened the way for evil to rule. In the old stories, the tale next turns to Jamshid, a king remembered not for terror, but for brilliance. His reign is introduced with a gift said to mark true rulers. Far, the divine royal radiance seen as the sign that a king governs with heavenly favor. With Far, Jamshid was more than a man with a crown. He was seen as the bearer of blessing itself, chosen and upheld by forces greater than himself. Legends say this light gave him authority, wisdom, and the strength to guide his people into an age unlike any before. Under Jamshid's rule, the land flourished. Peace held fast, disease was pushed back, and crafts and skills multiplied. He was remembered for guiding new arts of weaving and building, for teaching practices of health and sanitation, for drawing the scattered lives of people into an ordered society. For hundreds of years, he was celebrated at festivals, praised in poems, and honored as the guardian of Iran's well-being. When people looked at him, they did not see just a king seated on a jeweled throne. They saw the radiance of Far shining through him, proof that their ruler lived and ruled with divine approval. But light can grow blinding when turned upon itself. Over time, Jamshid's humility thinned. At first, it was scarcely a flicker, gestures of pride, a word or two lifting his own name too high. Yet slowly, he listened less to those who reminded him of his place. Fewer dared to correct him, until at last, even he no longer felt that correction mattered. In that quiet, his triumphs folded inward. He came to believe that the greatness around him was of his making alone. His voice began to carry claims not of service, but of divinity. He told his people that all power sprang from him, not from the Far. What had once been carried as a sacred trust, he now claimed as his own essence. The tale says that at that moment, the Far withdrew. It does not linger with arrogance. When a king proclaims himself self-sufficient, the divine favor slips from his grasp. Just as water pours through fingers that tighten too much, Jamshid's radiance drained away. His throne still stood. His crown still gleamed. But the brilliance had gone out. This was no fading by chance. Tradition insists it was the direct consequence of his hubris, a spiritual law that no king can cross and still remain appointed. The change was felt not only in Jamshid himself, but in the realm that rested beneath him. The people who had once trusted in his guardianship sensed that something essential had vanished. We are told that doubt widened through the kingdom. If their ruler no longer held divine favor, then what shield remained between them and misfortune? Confidence crumbled. Where there had been stability, unrest began to stir. Rumors of disquiet replaced songs of praise. The crown appeared intact, but it rang hollow, a shell without the light that gave it weight. Into this void, Zahhak stepped. His arrival is not presented as coincidence, but as consequence. The story frames it with symmetry. The moment a throne is emptied of blessing, something else will move to claim it. A field left untended sprouts not with grain, but with weeds. Jamshid's pride tore the roots of his kingdom loose, and Zahhak's curse slithered into the cracks. What one man abandoned in arrogance, another seized through ruin. The tale insists on this balance. Jamshid rose too high on his own name, and so his fall opened the way for evil carrying chains and serpents. Pride made the throne hollow, and hollow thrones invite new, darker shapes. This sequence is not unique to Jamshid alone. It is a recurring motif in Iranian tradition. Where far is lost to pride, another, often marked by cruelty, follows to claim power. Stories repeat this rhythm to remind their listeners that arrogance in rulers does not end with themselves. It carves weaknesses into the fabric of the whole community. Evil does not need strength to break down secure gates. It waits for cracks to form from within. Once Jamshid claimed a place higher than heaven allowed, the shelter was gone. His people were left exposed. Into that exposure, Zahhak entered carrying a curse no physician could heal. Notice how quietly the story frames this lesson. Jamshid's fall is not thundered as a warning. It is pictured as the dimming of a light. A crown without far is still a crown, but it lacks the luminous core that steadies it. And such emptiness does not remain still. It draws in shadows, for authority without blessing becomes a container that craves filling. That is how the serpent-burdened king came to power, not as a storm battering strong walls, but as night settling into a room left empty. What disappeared in pride returned in suffocating hunger. Through this slow shift, the story suggests a truth as old as its words, that the loss of virtue in leadership brings suffering far beyond the man himself. Arrogance in Jamshid created loss for all who relied on him. His throne, once radiant, became a vacancy that another filled with chains, and thus the people who had once basked in light now bowed beneath the shadow of Zahhak's serpents. Still, every age of darkness passes its weight forward, until an answer rises. The tale does not end at the loss. Even while Zahhak's power spread, despair was not absolute. In places far from palaces, ordinary hands began to stir, not with crowns or swords, but with small acts of defiance. Generations after Jamshid's pride and Zahhak's rise, courage returned from unexpected corners, and one day, those ordinary hands would create a symbol powerful enough to wake a kingdom. Picture a blacksmith standing in a king's hall. His hands are scarred where iron once burned him, his clothes marked by the soot of the forge. He spent his years shaping plows, nails, and tools for life's labor, not for war nor for courtly show. His name was Kaveh. He held no title, commanded no armies, and carried no wealth. Yet it was this man, with no crown but his apron, who gave shape to one of the most enduring symbols of freedom in the old tales, the raising of the blacksmith's apron as a banner. The story describes how Kaveh was led into Zahhak's palace. 2 of his sons had already been taken, sacrificed to the king's serpents. Now summoned again, he stood under the gaze of the tyrant. Before him lay a scroll. The scribes expected his mark of submission. Every noble and statesman before him had signed such documents to affirm that Zahhak ruled with justice. For those who endured the grief of children lost, this order of things was bitter but unquestioned. Yet when Kaveh read the words, he did not bend. Zahhak promised him favor if he would assent. Perhaps lands, perhaps protection. perhaps the small comfort of safety after so much loss. The courtiers hushed, leaning into the stillness of that hall. All waited for the sound of a seal pressed as so many others had been. But Kaveh would not. A voice rose from him, fierce with grief, condemning the slaughter of his sons. He lifted the scroll in his hands, and then, before the throne itself, he tore the parchment. Its false words split apart under his fingers. That tearing rang louder than shouts could, because it was heard in a place long sunk in silence. It was refusal made plain, offered not by a noble or warrior, but by a craftsman stripped of patience. And when this refusal was carried into a symbol, the story says it happened not through jewels or armor, but through what Kaveh already wore. His leather apron, rough with the marks of his forge, was tied to the point of a simple spear. With that act, workcloth became banner. The Darafsh Kaviani, later remembered as the flag of freedom, was born not in splendor, but from the smell of smoke and the scars of labor. One humble thing lifted high became the image of a people's suffering and their hope bound together. In a single humble act, a craftsman's apron became a visible stand for those who had endured centuries of loss. Those who saw the apron recognized themselves on its surface. They too bore the burns of toil, the scars of ordinary survival. What was raised above the throne was not foreign to them, not an emblem stitched in distant palaces, but the plain cloth they had known since childhood. It was a flag that said, "You are seen, you are not alone." More than speeches or swords, it gave form to the silent truth many had held within. The courtiers who gasped at Kaveh's act were joined by whispers on streets and in markets, until the gesture no longer belonged to him alone. As he carried the banner into the city, people began to gather. First a trickle, then more voices. They moved not because of shouts, but because the raised apron seemed to carry their own grief and longing. Across villages and across fields the word spread. Families who had watched their children taken away now found in this rag of leather a space to resist. Artisans added cloth to it. Merchants tied silks, and noble sympathizers fastened fine threads. Over time it grew radiant. Silk of China, brocade of Persia, even jeweled adornments stitched into its surface. Yet at its heart remained the plain apron of a blacksmith. That center never changed. In later tradition, the Darafsh Kaviani became more than a rebel's sign. It was honored as a national standard, carried forward through the centuries as a symbol of kingship itself. When later Shahs ascended their thrones, they redecked Kaveh's banner with still finer fabric and precious stones. What rose from one man's sorrow became a radiant sun amid gloom. Storytellers remembered that what now glittered at the courts of kings had once been rough hide tied to a spear, lifted by hands calloused from work. The contrast itself gave the image strength. This mattered because tyranny had ruled for so long that silence had become its foundation. Parents once bowed their heads, neighbors mouthed consent, and each morning the serpent hunger was met by resigned hands. Yet the blacksmith broke this circle. He acted, and because he acted, others awoke. The apron reminded them that it was not only the mighty who could answer injustice. One voice of resistance, showing its face openly, gave them courage to lift their own. The stories do not crown Kaveh with royalty or power. His name is remembered not because he won armies or wealth, but because he made visible an old truth. Tyranny cannot forever root itself where people dare to stand together. That is what gave the blacksmith his place in Iranian memory. Not a king, not a warrior, but a father and craftsman who, in losing too much, refused to give his silence as well. Think quietly of what this means. An apron, scorched and soiled, spoke louder than decrees or armies. It did not promise victory outright. It did something gentler. It opened a gathering place for shared courage. Through it, Zahhak's serpents found for the first time more than helpless victims. They found a people carrying a banner that said, "Loss can become strength, and silence can be broken." From this moment, the tide of the story begins to turn. When a new symbol is lifted above the crowd, it prepares the way for something greater to follow. And soon, the tale tells us, an answer would rise against the tyrant, a figure who would bring chains, iron, and the final judgment on Zahhak's long reign. Imagine the sound of iron resting against stone, chains stretched tight, and the stillness that follows once movement has ended. In these old stories, that stillness belongs to Zahhak, once a king, now forced into silence beneath a mountain. His throne was lost, his crown stripped away, yet his life was not taken. Instead, he was bound beneath Mount Damavand, where his punishment became more than a sentence. It became a reminder for all time. In the tale, Faradin was the one who carried out this act. Prophecies had long said he would rise, and when he came of age, he carried the hopes of people who had lived in Zahhak's shadow for generations. When their paths finally crossed, many might have expected the story to close with Zahhak's death. But Faradin's task carried a different instruction. According to tradition, the godly council warned that killing him would spread new evils into the world, vermin and corruption pouring from his flesh. And so Zahhak could not be ended by a blade. He had to be bound instead, held in a prison that would endure. That prison was set within Mount Damavand. In Persian myth, the mountain is not just rock and snow. It is a presence, vast, unmoving, and unshakable. To place Zahhak beneath it was to confine him under a guardian that no storm or army could unsettle. A dungeon wall might crumble, a fortress might burn, but a mountain is eternal. By choosing Damavand, the punishment became more than justice for one age. It became a sign for every age to come, an assurance that the tyrant's dark reign was ended and would remain ended. The act of binding him was described with deliberate symbols. Zahhak was seized with a lasso of lion skin, the strength of the fiercest beast turned into a restraint. Around him were wrapped chains of iron, cold and unyielding. Heavy nails and stakes were driven deep, fixing him against the stone. These bonds, made of hide, iron, and rock, carried their own language, the strength of beasts, the permanence of metal, and the immovable weight of the mountain itself. Each bound him not only in body but in memory, showing that every force able to endure was summoned against him. And why was this restraint chosen over death? Because death closes a story. It brings finality. Zahhak's reign was not meant to close in silence. His evil was not to be forgotten beneath the earth. Instead, he was left alive, bound in darkness where his serpents hissed without answer. His hunger filled the cavern with echoes, but no sacrifices came to still it. His torment continued, and in that continuation lived the warning. It was not enough that his cruelty had ended. It had to be remembered. His own body, chained and restless, became the reminder. This choice, of binding rather than killing, carried echoes across traditions. In Greek stories, the Titans were flung into Tartarus, held but not destroyed, their ruin kept separate from the living world. In Zoroastrian texts, Ajidahaka, another name for Zahhak, is spoken of as the gathering of every sin. And there too, the fate described was not destruction, but captivity until the world's end. Evil in these visions cannot simply be cut down. It must be contained, set apart, watched by forces as enduring as mountains themselves. When Persian families looked at Damavand, they did not see only snow and stone. They saw a guardian, and within it, a prisoner. To gaze on the mountain's peak was to be reminded of the chains beneath. That knowledge became a thread binding their own lives to the myth. Even if centuries passed, they would say, "Still he lies there, beneath rock that will not move." The mountain made sure his story could not fade into legend alone. It stood visible, rising above their valleys, linking landscape with memory. The picture is not of a spectacle of pain, but of a warning carried into permanence. Zahhak's punishment was not described so that listeners would dwell on cruelty. It was given to explain that tyranny must be more than overthrown. It must be shown, remembered, and kept from returning. Killing might have erased him, but chains beneath a mountain ensure that each new generation hears what he became. He was transformed from a ruler into a lesson, living but restrained, and his serpents a soundless weight in the dark. For most kings, the ending is simple: a tomb, a record, a name remembered in chronicles. But Zahhak is different. He is recalled not in rest, but in restraint. His story never slips fully into the past. The clink of his chains still echoes in memory. The mountain still marks his prison. To speak his name is to recall not only the sufferings he caused, but the truth that he will never walk free. He is made not into a man of history, but into a shadow of warning, a presence held outside of time. And so the old tales say, Zahhak rests in that cavern still, beneath iron stakes, beneath lion-skin straps, beneath Damavand's weight. His downfall did not close the story. It pressed it forward, asking listeners to remember the cost of pride, of hunger, of cruelty carried too far. Like a scar cut into the earth itself, his prison endures as reminder that tyranny can be ended, but it must also be seen and remembered so that it does not return. Think for a moment of what this asks of us: to hold memory not as a burden, but as a watchful guard. Zahhak is chained for eternity, yet his story continues to speak. And from here, the tale begins to shift its gaze, not on the mountain above him, but on the long years behind him, on the weight of a reign that stretched so far across generations it seemed endless. Close your eyes and consider what it means for a crown to drag across 1,000 years. In the old stories, Zahhak's reign is measured not in decades or even centuries, but in the daunting figure of 1,000 years. The tradition does not ask us to take this as a literal measure, but as a mythic scale, a way of showing how deeply his rule scarred the people's memory. 1,000 years does not describe the clockwork of history. It gives form to the feeling of weight that tyranny presses onto those who live inside it. For the people under his crown, time no longer flowed in seasons or lifetimes. Children were born, raised, and grew old, all beneath the same suffocating shadow. Grandfathers spoke of their youth as already marked by Zahhak. Their grandchildren, hearing such words, could imagine nothing else. Freedom became a story that faded with each retelling, until it sounded like something that belonged not to their land, but to another world entirely. When suffering stretches this far, despair becomes not just an experience, but a tradition, handed from one generation to the next. The number itself magnifies this truth. 1,000 years overwhelms by scale, hinting at endurance far beyond memory. It tells us what tyranny feels like when escape never comes. Endless. For human lives, brief as they are, oppression that persists for even a few generations grows to seem infinite. To those who first told this tale, that exaggeration was the point. By giving Zahhak so long a rule, they shaped into words the chilling belief that darkness can become the whole horizon, that it can erase the sense that another way of life is possible. And yet, the story reminds us that even this length was not without cracks. For Zahhak himself never lived free of reminders. In his sleep, dreams visited him, prophecies of his undoing. He saw a young hero rising, a savior who would topple him from his throne. These visions stirred even across centuries, never loosening their hold. Zahhak summoned wise men and interpreters, demanding reassurance, but their words confirmed what he most feared, that his reign, though stretched beyond imagining, was already destined to break. These dreams serve a clear purpose in the Shahnameh. They keep a thread of inevitability alive within the story, showing that tyranny cannot fully silence what waits beyond it. To his subjects, living year upon weary year, oppression seemed permanent. To Zahhak, who believed himself eternal, sleep itself whispered that he was not. Here lies a quiet irony. The people began to forget hope, but the tyrant could never forget it. He lived haunted by the very future they had lost sight of. From this tension comes a lesson that still feels steady and true. The reign of fear carries within itself the seed of its own end. Power drawn from cruelty lives always on borrowed time. However long it endures, however heavy it feels, justice waits beyond it, unaltered by centuries, unshaken by despair. Even the longest shadow holds the seed of its own end. What then does the story ask us to see in this millennium of suffering? It shows how oppression grows heavier when handed from parent to child, until people no longer recognize that there ever was a time before. But at the same moment, the story itself keeps watch on their behalf. When memory fails, the tale preserves the promise that one day the heaviness will lift. Just as mountain stone endures longer than crowns of gold, justice is said to outlast even a rule that mocks eternity. One way to picture this is to imagine a winter that refuses to break. Day after day, the sky holds gray, the trees bare. After long months, a child might believe it was always winter. Yet beyond sight, the world alters in small, unseen motions. Spring comes slowly, but it does not fail. Zahhak's reign is described in this same way, a season drawn past measure, so long that it felt permanent, but already turning toward its close. The 1,000 years, then, are not only a measure of suffering, but also a reminder of its limit. Time may hollow whole generations, but it still comes to an end. The story assures us that no crown weighs forever, no serpent coils without slack, and no tyranny is boundless. Zahhak's power lasted beyond the reach of memory, but it did not outlast the truth that lived beyond it. So when listeners heard of his 1,000 years, they did not only grieve the endurance of suffering, they also were given reason to believe that however far injustice extends, it cannot stretch into infinity. The number that first seems to crush instead reminds us, limits are written into even the darkest reign. The story holds both weights together, the despair of centuries and the quiet certainty of their ending. As Zahhak's reign closes in the Shahnameh, what remains with us is not only the length of his rule, but the image of what marked it most, the serpents that grew from his shoulders, feeding daily at the cost of his people. These creatures, perched where once only a man's flesh had been, carried the truth of what kind of ruler he became, and the lesson of why his story still endures. Picture two snakes that do not rise from soil or stone but grow outward from a ruler's own body. They sit at his shoulders, insistent and alive, not companions once chosen, but curses inseparable from his flesh. Wherever he walked, they walked. Wherever he sat, they coiled. They did not permit any who looked at him to forget what he had become. In Zahhak's case, the serpents are not ornaments or masks. They are the sign that something hidden inside has forced itself outward. At first hearing, these snakes may seem like nothing more than a grim motif to frighten children, but their constant presence tells us more. They externalize what is inward, appetites that have no natural end, craving power and feeding endlessly on others. In older sources, serpents appear with mixed meanings, sometimes life-giving, sometimes monstrous. The Avestan word Aji itself means serpent, a term that could describe guardian, demon, or dragon. In that spectrum of possibility, Zahhak, or Aji Dahaka, became remembered as the darker face of the motif. His snakes no longer suggested renewal or the promise of return, but the insatiable hunger of tyranny, a curse each person could see curled against his frame. The image long outlived the verses. Archaeological seals and signets from Bronze Age Iran and Central Asia sometimes show human figures flanked by snakes. Scholars debate whether and how that imagery connects to later Zahhak legends. What can be said with care is that the motif existed deep in the symbolic vocabulary of ancient rule. A simple lump of clay, pressed with a carved design, might have carried into markets and halls the image of a human linked to serpents. That alone tells us the figure was not only remembered as a tale, but also stamped into the practical instruments of daily authority. Why maintain such a daunting shape in art at all? The answer is found in the ambiguity of the serpent itself. In much of Iranian tradition, snakes did not only signal evil, they signified fertility, spirit, water, rebirth, and even immortality. The shedding of skin could mirror renewal, while their closeness to the soil marked them as guardians of land and life. And yet, in the same imagination, the serpent could be aligned with demons, feared as a consuming presence. To place such creatures alongside a ruler was to gather all of these threads, protection and destruction, blessing and curse, braided into one body. Zahhak shows us what happens when the darker thread seizes dominant form. By the time Ferdowsi wove the Shahnameh, the serpent's darker meaning defined Zahhak's legacy. The snakes would not accept barley or lamb, only the daily offering of 2 young brains, one to each mouth. In this detail lies both horror and allegory. Just as tyranny feeds itself on the lifeblood of its citizens, Zahhak's serpents consumed not labor, not coin, but the very minds of his people. To live beneath him was to live at risk of being chosen, your thoughts and potential becoming sustenance for his curse. In the symbol, corruption becomes visible. Authority that should guide and protect turns instead to devour the young. This is the interpretive force of the serpents. They make private greed public, so everyone can see the cost of unchecked rule. Other sovereigns might attempt to cloak their failings behind banners or public words. Zahhak had no such shield. His body gave the truth plainly, bears of corruption in muscular coils staring back at his subjects. Courtiers who approached him never faced only a king. They faced a crown paired with 2 restless mouths, living proof that their ruler's flaw could not be covered. Symbols often carry this doubling. Across cultures, serpents appear not only at the margins of caution, but also at the cores of banners. In Iran itself, Images of dragons and snakes appeared on standards long after Zahhak's tale, lifted in moments of war as signs of strength and endurance. Such uses were not contradictions, but reminders that symbols never reduce to one meaning. The serpent can terrify when bound to tyranny, but the same form may inspire when raised as a mark of shared identity. Its power lies in persistence. Snakes never appear meek in image. Whether feared or honored, they announce presence and cannot be ignored. Reflect on how this particular image of Zahhak worked. He could not dismiss his serpents. They stood visible each morning. That spectacle carved itself not only into memory, but into warning. It told those who saw that power without justice cannot be hidden forever. In time, it presses so visibly outward that eyes cannot escape the truth. Unchecked authority makes its decay evident across the king's very being. In this way, the serpents became not just companions to Zahhak, but lessons visible for his whole kingdom. Their lesson is direct. They reveal corruption as it truly is, neither clever nor hidden. They show what lies inside erupting into form, so that no robe or crown can disguise it. By placing the serpents on Zahhak, the Shahnameh insists that tyranny eventually unmasks itself. The ruler's private hunger, his unshared greed, all come sooner or later into plain sight. And when they do, those who serve him must acknowledge the sight, however silently, just as the serpents hissed at each courtly assembly. That is why the image endures. While time has shifted serpents' meanings, at once tied to fertility, to rebirth, to destruction, it is their ambivalence that kept Zahhak's tale alive. In his story, they settled into the role of corruption's mark, demanders of sacrifice. Yet alongside, memory kept their other shapes, visible in seals, on banners, in art. One creature holding two sides, life and death, blessing and curse. This dual weight pressed into imagination explains why the tale does not fade, and why even now, serpents remain a potent sign across myth and history alike. This ambivalence, serpents as both life and death, is what keeps Zahhak's image alive across tales and objects. And as the story closes its circle, we are left to consider not only the memory of serpents, but the figure who still lies bound, his reign ended, yet his shadow speaking as warning. Bound beneath Mount Damavand, Zahhak rests in story not as a king, but as a warning. His throne is gone, yet his serpents still speak, showing how unchecked ambition consumes others, and how tyranny feeds upon those it claims to guard. And still, the tale keeps a gentler thread. Quiet courage, like the cooks who spared youths in secret, or the blacksmith who raised his apron, reminds us that even in long darkness, people can act together and bring change. The story holds both truths, the danger of pride and the power of shared defiance. If you enjoyed this quiet telling, consider liking and subscribing for more stories to drift to sleep with. Carry this as a gentle reminder. Justice endures, patient as stone.